Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Her Faith Inspires podcast, where we take cultural issues and we tackle them with biblical truth. Today, we're going to talk about being unequally yoked and what that means. And I'm going to lay this out in a few stages. And the reason I'm doing this episode is because I've received several questions about it from the single ladies who listen to the podcast. I've also had some moms ask me how we talk about this with our boys. And then even wives like asking, how do I handle a spouse who's not a believer? And right now, I personally have 6 teenagers in my family and 3 of them who just got out of teens. They're in their 20s now. They're not in their 20s, they're 20. They just turned 20 like a few months ago, last week. And so they're all the 20-year-olds are currently dating or have been talking to, others to date. And then the 18-year-olds who are just turning 18, 17 and 18-year-olds have also dated. So we're going through this, and I thought, you know what, let's put this all together and talk about all these different subjects with it. Before we get into that, I want to let you know about an online conference I am speaking at called Mama, It's Time to Roar. The Mama part stands for Moms Against the Mainstream Agenda. If you'd like to go or attend the online conference, please see my events calendar on my website, shandafulbright.com. I will also be speaking at an in-person conference in Pickens, South Carolina on September 23rd. You can find that info on the site as well. Today, we're going to talk about, one, what does it mean to be unequally yoked? So we need to lay that groundwork before we get into looking at what it means to either be dating a project or looking for a partner. Second, if you're married and you're unequally yoked, what do you do? If you're single and you want to get married, how are you handling the standard of do not be unequally yoked in dating relationships? And finally, how do you talk to your kids about being unequally yoked? A couple of years ago, I was talking to a friend about dating, and I said, the Bible encourages us to find a partner, not a project. One of my nephews is contemplating asking a girl out on a date, but she's not a Christian. And he told his mom, well, I can invite her to church. And if she agrees to go to church, maybe she'll become a Christian. And that's where I started to talk to her about letting him know the Bible does not encourage us to find a project, but a partner. And we see this concept in 2 Corinthians 6:14-18. It says, do not be yoked together with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? What harmony is there between Christ and Belial? Or what does a believer have in common with an unbeliever? What agreement is there between the temple of God and idols? Do you see all these contrasts, light and dark, believer and unbeliever? For we are the temple of the living God, as God has said, I will live with them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Therefore, come out from among them and be separate, says the Lord. Touch no unclean thing, and I will receive you, and I will be father to you, and you will be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty. We often talk about being unequally yoked in marriage, but this isn't isolated to marriage. It's in regard to a partnership between believers and unbelievers. So notice the contrast. Again, a believer with an unbeliever, light with darkness, the temple of God and, idols. There are some Christians who say unequally yoked means someone from a different denomination and unbelievers. And that is not true. If you are partnering with someone who believes in the fundamentals of Christianity, but may be of a different denomination, then you are not unequally yoked per this verse. It doesn't mean that you won't have to work out some details, especially if you're going to, marry someone who is a Baptist or from a Baptist denomination and you go to like a Pentecostal denomination. Though there will be some things to talk about. You will maybe have the challenge of finding a church together, but it doesn't mean that you're unequally yoked because you're both saved. So I want to make that really clear here because it gets misconstrued sometimes. Oh, you're unequally yoked if you're from a different denomination. It's just not true, as long as it's from a Christian denomination. If someone is a New Ager and you're a Christian, then you're unequally yoked. The contrast here is between a believer and an unbeliever. They're moving in opposite directions. They have different goals, different lifestyles, and different desires. How can you move together? And that's where we get the language of being yoked together. This is why it's important to understand the culture of the first century when the New Testament was written, because we really don't have oxen and yokes and things like that. I mean, I don't know of one person who does. So in order to get the full picture of that and to see the analogy and what Paul's talking about in that representation, it's good to go back to the first century culture and understand why to them it made sense. And Got Questions explains it this way. A yoke is a wooden bar that joins two oxen to each other and to the burden they pull. An unequally yoked team has one stronger ox and one weaker, or one taller and one shorter. The weaker or shorter ox would walk more slowly than the taller, stronger one, causing the load to go around in circles. When oxen are unequally yoked, they cannot perform the task set before them. Instead of working together, they are at odds with one another. When two people get married, they become one flesh. That's what the Bible tells us. That shows unity. They are one in Christ. When they are unequally yoked, they are not in unity. So unequally yoked means you are uniting yourself in partnership, whether in business or in marriage, to an unbeliever. What do you do if you're married and you're unequally yoked? Again, this means that someone is married to an unbeliever. Now, again, we do not see where the Bible encourages us to marry unbelievers, but you might get saved after you got married and your spouse doesn't get saved or doesn't want to go to church. That would be a different situation. Or you might marry someone who isn't saved, even if you are a Christian. And now you're like, what do I do? Because I want a spiritual leader of the home. I want my husband to want to go to church with us. That's going to be yoked to someone who does not carry the same burden as you, who's not going in the same direction as you. So now what do you do? How do you handle this? If this happens, it's going to be difficult because think back to the oxen carrying the yoke, being yoked together. There's a natural struggle there when one is stronger and one's weaker. When two oxen are not carrying the same weight or when they want to go in different directions, it presents a struggle. God does not give us, though, a way out of the marriage or permission to divorce our unbelieving spouse. 1 Corinthians 7:12-14 says this, "To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord, if any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy." So if the unbelieving spouse is willing to stay married to you, let them and don't divorce them. But what else can you do? Like, how do you live practically on a day in and day out basis with somebody who does not share the same beliefs as you? I think we have to remember that there is a spiritual battle here that takes place for the soul of every human being. The unsaved person is in darkness. But if you are saved, you're shining the light of Christ in your home and in your marriage. Darkness is the absence of light. But if you shine the light of Christ, it doesn't go unnoticed. How can it? Just picture yourself in a dark room with no windows, no nothing. And if someone even lights a tiny match, you can see it from a very far, far distance. That means it's noticed. Even the darkest places, light is noticed. You might not see the effects of your conduct or of your holding to your standards, the way that you're teaching your kids, the way that you treat your spouse. But just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not taking place. So don't get discouraged. Just like light is seen very, very easily in darkness, that's how your testimony can be for Christ in your home. It will take diligence. It will take you practicing self-control, but it is going to take you being the one to be the example of Christ. Also remember that your conduct is so important. 1 Peter 3:1-2 says, "Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives." So that's verse 1. I'm going to read verse 2 in a minute, but I just want to draw this out so that you see how important it is. Peter is saying, if you're submitting to your own husbands and they don't believe the word, they don't follow the word of God, They can be won over without words by your own behavior, just by how you treat them. Isn't that pretty cool? Because it will, I mean, I'm not saying that spouses don't test us. I have a believing husband. We test each other all the time with our attitudes because we're not perfect people. So it can be challenging if they're an unbelieving spouse, but your words aren't going to win them over as much as your conduct, as much as your behavior. Again, how you treat them, how you take care of your home, how you love them. And verse 2 says, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives, that will be a testimony to them. It's such a powerful verse because when something bothers me, I want to call it out. I want to talk about it. I want to pop off at you. And Peter's saying, if you do that, you're ruining it. So Peter is reminding us that we can do so much good by being quiet, but by walking and showing and living out the light of Christ in our homes. And it takes some self-control. And I think it's hard. I think it's very difficult. And for those of you that have unbelieving spouses, my heart goes out to you because that is difficult. I can imagine how difficult it would be because marriage itself takes patience and love and kindness. But the Bible addresses that. We just read it. And it shows that in your conduct, in your behavior, not your words so much, are you going to persuade your spouse. That's very powerful because women, on average, more women like to talk things out and are more expressive in their language than I think men can be. Not always. I think there is a statistic that challenges that men do talk a lot, but they talk a lot about different things. And that's the point. I think women talk more about the things that bother them than men do. And just go back to Proverbs. I don't have this in my notes, but Proverbs tells us that when a woman is complaining and griping and being that continual dripping of annoyance, the man will leave and go sit on the roof. And back in those days, and I'm sure it's still like this, I mean, the climate is still the same in the Middle East. It's dry and it's hot. That's the last place you want to be, is on your rooftop. You don't want to be, you'd rather be in the house where at least it's cooler. But a man's so willing to get away from the yakety yak yak of the wife that he's willing to go sit out in the hot sun on the rooftop. We don't want to drive them away. We want to draw them in with our behavior and conduct that reflects Christ. Easy to say, yeah. Hard to do, oh my gosh, so hard to do. And don't forget, prayers move the hand of God. I think we underestimate the power of prayer. But as a praying wife, you're fighting the spiritual battle for your husband, for his soul. And he doesn't even know about it unless you tell him. But I think you fighting that in prayer with the Lord is something, there's something to be said of that. And unbelieving spouses do come to the Lord. If you watched or read the movie, or, if you read the book, A Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, check that out. I mean, it will encourage you because he says his wife got saved first, and then he was just like pushing against Christianity, did not want to believe in God. And then now if you've heard of Lee Strobel, he wrote The Case for Christ, but he's a great apologist. And then ask your pastor to pray, rally your church friends. And I have a list of people that I pray for in my prayer journal. Send me your spouse's name and I'll write it in my prayer journal and I'll pray too. I'll make mention of them in my prayers. If you're single and you want to get married, how are you handling the standard of do not be unequally yoked in dating? I got married when I was 25, almost 26, and I had the standard that you had to be a Christian. I spent 4 years in a relationship that I wasn't supposed to be in, but the guy said he was a Christian and he even preached. He's the assistant pastor. He was the assistant pastor at our church and he preached often. And he went on trips with our youth and our young adult group. So he was like in the mix of the church and in church leadership, but he was a wolf in sheep's clothing. And that didn't come out for a while. And I started dating him when I was 21. But no matter what, I held on to my standards. And those were, I wanted a Christian man and I would not have sex before marriage. Those were the standards I had, regardless of what the person I dated wanted. I knew it was against God's word to have sex before marriage. So that meant living with each other wasn't even on the table. I never even considered it. It wasn't never even crossed my mind as an option. So what's my point in saying that? My point is the reason you don't want to be unequally yoked when you date is because God's commands are your standards. Those were my standards before I even went into dating, and they remain my standards through dating. I think I had like 3 or 4 boyfriends, but all of them were very short term. And one of them was a pastor's kid, and he thought we should explore sexually before we got married. And I was like, no, aren't you a pastor's kid? Like, what the heck, dude? Like, you should be, but I guess pastors' kids get a bad rap. And I don't think obviously all pastors' kids are like that, but pastor's kid or not, doesn't mean that you have the same standards. My point is, just because you go to church with them, just because that they say they're a Christian, doesn't mean necessarily that they are living by God's standards. But if your standards are God's commands, then, and they don't want to go with that, then you can tell right away, okay, well, you're not even living by God's command. So what does that say of your relationship with God? And you can gauge whether or not you're unequally yoked. So make sure it's your standard. That makes the burden light, because men and women are naturally attracted to each other by God's design. You're going to want to have sex with the person that you date. I mean, we might as well just reconcile that. The temptation's real. And I don't think Christians should act like you won't want to have sex. I think we actually do a detriment to our kids and single Christians when we pretend like that's not even on the table. Yes, reconcile that. That's how you're wired. There's nothing wrong with you. You're not an evil person. And I've mentioned this before. I've mentioned this on other podcast episodes where I've talked about how to talk to your kids about sex. They're part of the honest conversations that we have, even on a podcast with our kids, with the person that we're dating. So again, don't feel like a sinner or that you're evil because you want to have sex with the person you're dating. But if you have to think ahead, well, you have to think ahead. You have to think ahead for how you will keep that standard until you get married, how we will work through that together as we're dating that person so that we keep God's command. And those are going to take some awkward conversations with people. But if you already know and see the fruits of their life in Christ, that you know that they are saying that they're a Christian and they should want to hold to that standard themselves. It's culturally acceptable to live together and have sex with someone before marriage. And this is trickled into the church. There are some Christians who think it's okay to live together before marriage or to just have sex before marriage. Not true. But that doesn't mean that God's word has changed just because the culture finds it acceptable. And I've been studying 1 John, and I read the other day, and I actually marked it because it stood out to me so much, not in this regard to this topic per se, but that God's commands are not burdensome. John says God's commands are not burdensome. Why does he make it a point to say that? Because a lot of people think God's commands are burdensome, that they're just a bunch of do's and don'ts, and God's a killjoy and he doesn't want me to have any fun. A burden, though, is when you carry a heavy load. So God's not putting a load on you that you cannot carry. He actually says they're light. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. So God's saying, hey, I know what the world's saying. They're saying that my commands are burdensome, but they're not. They're actually light. The Bible is clear that sin is a burden. Psalms 38:4 says, my iniquities or sin have gone over my head. As a heavy burden, they are too heavy for me. So for us to think that just to wait until marriage is a burden, it's actually more of a burden to have sex before marriage, because God has designed sex for marriage for a reason. According to Pew Research, 78% of young adults aged 18 to 29 think it's acceptable to live together before marriage. But just because everyone is doing it doesn't mean it's permissible by God. The majority is not the authority when it comes to morality and truth. We have to remember that if God is the standard, he's already told us by the command that he gave us that that should be our standard too, which makes it a light burden to keep us from the burden of sin. There is a family crisis in our country in regard to people getting married later in life, living together instead of committing themselves in marriage. And I believe that the reason for that, it's based on the statistics we see from many people or many sources that give us the statistics. It's all having to do with sex. Easy access to sex has caused this delay in marriage. It's caused people to just go live together and not really see the value in marriage itself. And there is an old saying, and I believe it's true: why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free? And basically the milk is on every, street corner, and they're passing it out in gallons, and it doesn't cost much anymore because we've cheapened it. We've cheapened sex, which devalues marriage. When we live together before marriage, we cheapen the relationship. It takes away a certain level of commitment, but you get all the benefits of a married couple. And then it's easier to walk away. So let's tie this back into the concept of marrying a partner versus marrying a project. And we see that if we both have the same standards that God has commanded us, then we have a partner. We have someone who can share the yoke of having saving sex for marriage and living as Christ commands, or we can date someone that we've lowered the standards for and carry a burden of the yoke ourselves. We can carry the bulk of it ourselves. Marriage is a great thing, but I believe that it starts with you setting the standard in your life, which is God's command for your dating relationships. And it takes seeing your value as a woman of God so that you do not lower the standard for any man who's not willing to first love God himself and then carry the burden with you in life. That's the best partnership. And that means he's not a project, he's a partner. So how do you talk to your kids about not being unequally yoked? So I wasn't allowed to date until I was 16, and I really didn't have anyone to date at that age. So it was like, whatever. My husband and I carried that rule over into our home for our boys, that they can't date until they're 16. And I have 2 over that age now, and neither of them have really had serious relationships yet. My youngest has a few years before he can start dating. So honestly, I'm just glad that we're not there yet. And I think that there are 3 things that we can remember when we talk to our kids about this, because it's not just, I've talked before about how to talk to your kids about saving sex for marriage, what sex is, things like that. I think I've done like 2 or 3 podcast episodes on that, but I've never really talked about how to talk to your kids about the purpose of dating. So I'm going to lay out 3 things to think about as you approach this subject, and the sex talk will be intertwined in it because that's going to come up naturally because they're going to be dating. So first, talk to your kids about the purpose of dating. What is the reason you want to date someone? And what is the reason you should want to date someone? Because there's a purpose. It's to find a wife or a husband. That's the purpose. You're not dating willy-nilly. Because if you have a purpose to dating, then you have a standard for dating. It's not so that you can fit in with the friends who are dating. Because I know what it's like when all of your friends are dating and you're not. You feel like the weirdo in the bunch. So I just better go like somebody. But that's not the purpose of dating. The purpose of dating is to find the spouse for marriage. And so that's why I think now, because I set the standard for 16 for my boys, I just think it's too young. Like, think about a 16-year-old. They barely got their license to drive. And then they're going to start thinking about who they want to marry. I don't think so. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't go on like group dates and they can't go do things with people from church. I mean, you can navigate that how you see fit with your own kids. But for me, I'm kind of like, yeah, 16 is too young. There's no way I would let my 16-year-old pick up a date and then them go off by themselves and date. I just feel like you're barely a junior in high school. You still have 2 more years. No way. That age may be like a case by case basis, depending upon your own kids. But if you tell your 17-year-old, like, never mind, or maybe even a 16-year-old, never mind, I'm not going to let you date, and you've never had these conversations, that's when you're going to see that typical teenage attitude come out. And so if you're like laying the standard for your family earlier on, it's not going to take them by surprise. Even my 13-year-old, he just finished 7th grade, and he was telling me there's a couple little girls who like him, and he's sporty. He's, if I do say so myself, he's very cute. He's always been cute. He's always had a lot of girls like him. And he was like, Mom, it doesn't really matter, because what do middle schoolers know about relationships? And so he knows the drill. Like, yeah, they can like you and think you're cute. I think you're cute too. But no dating, mister. Like, it's not happening. You're barely 13 years old. So you have to have those conversations early on. They know what to expect. And that just becomes the standard for your home, because you're helping your kids understand the purpose of dating. If you don't have a purpose to dating, then dating at 13 isn't so bad, right? There's no purpose to dating. But a 13-year-old, again, isn't even in high school, can't even drive, can't do all the other things that they're required to get a certificate for. They're not going to be able to handle certain relationships and heartbreak and things like that very easily. Can they do it? Sure. But why? They have to understand there's a purpose to dating. Second, talk to them about the standards for someone that they want to date. Okay, so now they know the purpose of dating is to what to look for in a future husband or a wife. Second, how do I know? What do I look for? And that's the standard that they want to set for themselves. They set that standard now by saying the question of all questions. Are they a believer? We're taking this back to 2 Corinthians, right? Do not be unequally yoked with an unbeliever. So their standard for someone that they date should be, are you a believer? And then how do you know? And then so if my kids say to me, oh, I really think this girl's pretty, and this has happened a couple months ago, is she a Christian? Well, I asked my friends and they said that she doesn't have a very good reputation. And my middle child's response was, yeah, isn't that just the way it is? There are no cute Christian girls. So I'm like, well, there are, and you can be patient and you'll figure that out. But he was investigating her reputation with other people before he thought about dating her. Because again, the first question is she a believer? How do you know? So help your kids navigate that, help them know what to look for as far as a believer, what they look for in somebody who is a believer, what questions that they should ask, what reputation that person has, which usually if they go to school together or something, you can find out the reputation, or they have maybe some sort of background with them. If they go to church together, that helps. But if they just are going in cold turkey and don't know anybody, don't know the person they're attracted to, it's going to take them knowing the right questions to ask. It doesn't happen naturally for kids. So don't think that your kids are just going to go to church and automatically know how to navigate dating. Again, what's the purpose in dating? They're not thinking at 16 years old, oh, I wonder if I'm going to marry this person. Most likely they're not. There might be some kids out there, but that's not really what they're thinking about. They need to keep that in the forefront of their mind. Is this someone worth investing in and putting my time into and possibly laying my heart on the line to get broke? Because nothing's worse than you seeing your kids go through heartbreak. I mean, I always say this, when my kids feel pain, I hurt with them. When they're joyful, I rejoice with them. It's like one and the same. And we have to be careful so they are smart to guard their hearts. So we have, what's the purpose in dating? We have setting the standard for the person that you date. Finally, why is it important to do these things? Your kids need the reason, the why behind the purpose of dating and the standard for dating. We can't just tell our kids, oh yeah, ask them if they're saved and, that's it. They need to know why this is important. Why does God bring this command? Why should I make this my standard? Because it should be important to your child first before it can be important that they do it. And a lot of the kids, this is the reason that I'm passionate about apologetics. Apologetics is the why or the defense. They're good reasons to support why we believe what we do about God. But there is a why or a reason for God's commands, and that includes marriage. If we're Christians and everything we do looks differently from the rest of the world, that means dating relationships do too. What does Christian dating look like in comparison to the culture? The culture is telling your kids that it doesn't matter who they date. The culture is not giving your kids standards for dating. The culture is not keeping the sanctity of marriage, but they're redefining marriage. They're not encouraging abstinence. They are encouraging quote unquote safe sex and providing ways to make it easier to have sex without hopefully passing on STDs. And if you do not talk to your kids about these things, the culture already is. And they have no other way, especially a biblical worldview to challenge what the culture is feeding them if we don't tell them these things. When we have the conversation with our kids about being unequally yoked, we naturally include the sex talk because it comes in here. It comes into play here. And when we talk about the differences between the culture and what God says about marriage, we give them the reason that we make God's commands our standards. His commands are not burdensome, and they actually keep us from having to bear the heavy burden of a rocky relationship had we not stuck to his commands as our standard. The view that marriage has a lot to do with the concept of being equally yoked is true. Like, we have to view marriage that way. We have to have that concept of being equally yoked, partnering with the person. Are we going into these relationships with the idea that we have a standard for marriage? The culture has cheapened all of these things that make marriage better, that make marriage valuable, I think is the better word. Marriage is valuable when we stick to God's commands for it. And we've made that our standard. Sean McDowell just posted a reel with a quote that it was by another artist, but I went ahead and wrote down what he said because it was really good. He said, practicing Christians are the least likely to get a divorce. And those who have lower body counts, that's sex partners, are the least likely to get a divorce. So if you're a practicing Christian, meaning practicing, go back to John, 1 John again, when we talked about he who practices righteousness and he who practices lawlessness. Like, you can practice obeying God's commands and you can practice breaking them. Okay, when those who practice God's commands are least likely to get a divorce. Those who have lower sex partners are least likely to get a divorce. Those practicing Christian who were each other's first as intimately, sexually, are the least likely to get a divorce. When they pray together, they're least likely to get a divorce. All of these things lead to longer and more satisfying marriages. There's your why. That's what you tell your kids. When we follow God's ways, it ends up better. It ends up valuable. We don't cheapen it. This is what makes God's commands not burdensome. The outcome of keeping them keeps us from the burden of sin. So let's take this back to the title of this episode. The Bible doesn't encourage us looking for a project, but a partner. Do you really want a project? If you go into the relationship telling yourself, oh, I can take him to church, he's a project. If he's not meeting the standard now, what makes you think that he'll meet the standard when you get married? If you tell yourself that he'll be better, he'll get better and become who you want him to be, he's a project, not a partner. If he only wants to go to church because he wants to date you and that's your standard and not his, he's a project, not a partner. Some ladies will say, oh, but he said he wants to come to church with me. He says now, I'll go to church with you. It's okay. Well, why is he doing that? Is he interested in God or is he interested in you? Because if he's not interested in God, he's a project. He only wants to attend church, but he doesn't want to be equally yoked. And let me remind you that only God saves. We can't save anyone. And, so don't think that, oh, if he comes to church, he'll just get saved, or I'll talk to him and he'll get saved. It's just not the way that God has set it up. He said, don't be unequally yoked. So don't even start with dating somebody who's not a Christian, a believer. Now, that doesn't mean that he can't go to church for all the wrong reasons, and then, which is you, and then he ends up getting saved. I'm not saying that that's not a possibility, but I am saying it's not a guarantee. If your standard is a partner and not a project, he'll go with you for God. He won't go with you for you. There's a huge difference there. I want to wrap this up by saying this. We're very smart people, and all of the evidence is there. We can judge people by their fruits, and people reveal themselves very quickly. Now, there are times that we're deceived. Don't get me wrong. I was deceived for a while, but the signs start showing up. Red flags start coming, and I ignored those for a very long time because it wasn't what I wanted it to be. Even though the picture I saw also wasn't what I wanted it to be. I just didn't want to go through the hardship of dumping that person or breaking off the relationship because it's hard. But if he's a partner or a project. And if you haven't got either in your life right now because you're not dating anyone, then you have no dilemma. But you can have a standard, the standard of God's commands. And if you keep the standard, you'll be better off because it's going to save you from a big burden later. If you have a project in your life and you're not married, you do have a dilemma. A dilemma means you're in a position where a difficult choice has to be made. And I'm not going to pretend like those things are not hard. Again, they are hard. But if you're a Christian and you are considering marrying a project, you are compromising the standard. And that means your marriage is going to be a lot harder, or even just the relationship right now is difficult. That's what 2 Corinthians tells us. You're carrying a load together in marriage and you're already off balance. You're already carrying the heavier part of that load. But if you're married to an unbeliever, remember what Peter said and trust God for the unseen. Pray for your husband and rally the troops and shine the light of Christ in your home. Finally, have these conversations with your kids. It doesn't come naturally to them. They need guidance on how to navigate relationships. Teach them to raise the standard in their dating relationships because it will matter to them in their marriages. They will appreciate you talking to them now instead of waiting until later. And it might even save you from the hardship of watching them date someone after they've already given their heart to an unbeliever, because that's going to be much more difficult. Have these conversations with them. Their dating years are going to last a lot less time than their marriage years, prayerfully, right? Help them get off on the right foot right away. If you have any questions for me, email me at hello@shandafulbright.com. And if you have any podcast episode ideas that you want me to tackle, send them my way and I'll be happy to see what I can do. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave a 5-star rating and review because I read every one of them and I appreciate all of them. Until then, I'll catch you on the next one.